Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. This is episode 11. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Team CCC, who's looking for a new sponsor, and some of the sponsorship and ownership structures within pro cycling teams. So just as the Tour de France was beginning its belated start at the end of August, Team CCC, led by Jim Oshowitz, owned by Continuum Sports LLC, was looking for a new sponsor. And as we've mentioned in previous episodes, you can look at, episode 9. We've talked a little bit about the sponsorship structure and the funding structure and the team ownership structure within cycling. In episode 9, it's a really quick episode. We kind of run through what the change in title sponsors have been over time. We look through that. It's a very quick episode. It's good. I would encourage you to go listen to it. But one of the takeaways is, even in this purely sponsorship model, which we'll talk a little bit more about here even in this episode, it brings into question what is the value of that sponsorship. Really, what is the efficacy of that sponsorship if the title sponsors change over so much, and if it's really not related to how well you perform on the road. Team CCC is looking for a sponsor, but Team Sky, and of course Team Sky was an extremely dominant team on the road, absolutely the most dominant team, was looking for a new sponsor at the end of 2019 after a 10-year sponsorship by Sky, but still looking for a new sponsor. And we're going to talk more about that in greater detail in this episode. But it brings into question what is, even in a purely sponsorship model, where the vast majority of the revenue comes from sponsorships, what is the efficacy of that sponsorship if so much changeover occurs? And again, we kind of discussed that a little bit in episode 9. So as we mentioned, there is basically a pure sponsorship model with cycling and with the way that it's set up. So we'll look at a couple points of what that means. It's mostly intuitive, but again, just to kind of frame up the structure in cycling with the sponsorship model. So you've got the model for pro cycling, and really all of cycling funding for the teams is sponsorship, is using the jersey as a billboard for sponsors. This is allowed and encouraged by the leagues and the races and that kind of stuff, which is more than can be said for a sport like running, where there was a big issue and Nick Symmonds kind of went to bat with them a little bit, where they said, you can only have one sponsor on your jersey, that kind of thing. And he ended up putting a tattoo on his shoulder to sort of sell that shoulder space, because he said, hey, you didn't mention shoulder space, that kind of thing. In cycling, they don't really, they do allow the sale of the bike, of the shoes, of the sunglasses, of the helmets, everything to sponsors. And, in turn, and this kind of seems reasonable and intuitive, but as this sponsorship area is encouraged to be sold by the teams, there's not a big pot split by the race organizers to the teams. It's sort of, we won't sell your shirt space, but you will, kind of a thing. So the race organizers, they, for the most part, and there's some exceptions, leaders' jerseys and things like that, but for the most part, the race organizers don't really split, say, TV revenue or sponsorship of the event money to the teams, but in turn, the teams then are able to sell their jersey space as they see fit. And so that brings up the sort of traditional questions of the event, the organization, the league structure, how is the money split? And we'll get into, greater detail of that later in a little bit in this episode. But there's still kind of a question that remains even about sponsorship efficacy if so many sponsors are changing and changing so often. So for instance, in CCC's case, which we'll just talk about because it's current, they only secured the CCC sponsorship 2 years ago. Now, CCC, the maker of these handbags, has gotten into financial difficulty with COVID. the COVID situation, and so they're forced to cut expenses, and something like marketing and cycling is sort of the first to go. And again, CCC may be in a position, the cycling team may be in a position where no matter what they did on the road, or no matter to some degree how effective the sponsorship was, it still might have been an expense that was cut by CCC. Now, according to the NS Sportsman, CCC's budget in 2019 was $12.5 million, which was actually the third most in the Tour de France that year. And if their sponsorship situation and financial situation is anything similar to some of the other large teams like Team Sky and Ineos, which we'll get into in greater detail later in this episode, then most likely that $12.5 million, a big portion of that was paid by CCC as the title sponsor to basically represent a large component of the annual budget. So Team CCC, again, here they've got the third largest budget in cycling. They're looking for a new sponsor, and this is a common thing. A lot of these teams go through it. They look for these sponsors, etc., etc. Now, again, cycling has its structure with the events, with the sponsorships, with the individual riders having certain deals that they can do with outside companies dependent on the rider. Somebody like Peter Sagan can do deals with the organizers of the Giro. He can do deals with Specialized. He can do deals, outside of deals that the team has negotiated. Contador, obviously Lance, those kinds of people could do that, but it's not super common. And the main structure is that the team sells its bike positioning, it sells its jersey space, all of that kind of stuff. But, and again, there's big questions on, would there be a better way to do it? Would there be a way to fix the number of teams potentially and have the ownership be more fluid between, current directors, riders, event organizers, those kinds of things, and fix the number of teams, and then instead have that equity float around to be able to be more exposed to, event sale of TV revenue and that kind of stuff, and event sale of sponsorships for the event, and combine that with sale of sponsorships to teams. Maybe the teams all ride one bike or something. I mean, that's a little much, but that kind of a thing. Or maybe there's they all have the same tires or something like that, like in Formula One currently. And that's a great and really enthralling question, and something that we're gonna dig into more, because there's really a lot there. But even within the current setup where you have the events, and then you have the teams selling their sponsorships, and the teams are constantly trying to get funding, and they're trying to keep riders and do well and be in the races. And the events, these big races, the Tour de France, they're sort of separate. They're selling their commercial wares separately from the teams, etc. And that's the current model. So let's sort of work within that. And within the current model, a team like Team Sky, which is now Team Ineos, and Team Ineos Grenadier, a team like that, they've had the biggest budget. And that's something that we, mentioned before, that they had with Team Sky, and it looks like the peak of their sponsorship was towards the end of the Sky run in terms of the dollars that they had. And that number was something like, in total, something like $40 million, something like that, of a budget, $40-50 million. And that was by far the largest. That was, again, you can kind of see, most teams are running around that $10 to $12 million, $15 million, some closer to 20, and those are the biggest teams. Those are the Pro Tour teams. And so within this context, there's this team that sort of stands out that's done really well. And what it looks like, and again, there could be other variations, but what it generally looks like with these teams is that they set up something like EF Education First and the CCC team. They set up holding companies, and they sort of have their management group and their owners. We all know who they are. The owners, and they have this holding company, and the holding company goes out and it sort of seeks to set up a cycling team. It seeks to set up sponsors, to align sponsors, to pay for the riders. The owners, the part owners, are former cyclists or team directors or, very involved in the management of the team itself. And they're set up with this holding company and they're seeking sponsors, and that title sponsor, again, as we mentioned in episode 9, rotates pretty frequently, even though that ownership of the holding company itself may stay the same. So you've got this title sponsor that rotates pretty frequently, and a holding company where you sort of have the same ownership structure. You've got, team BMC is then team et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then it's team CSC, and it's going to be something else next year, and that kind of thing. And again, that structure is pretty common, in cycling, especially in the lower levels of cycling, and but again, it creates hardship. Not necessarily that structure, but that ownership structure combined with the current sponsorship structure. You've got Team CCC that's got to let Greg Van Avermaet go to AG2R because they're title sponsors up in the air, and the way that these teams are set up, the title sponsor is the main funder of the budget, and they've got these issues. So within this context, we've got this sort of standout Team Sky that's held this massive budget, and they have a different ownership structure. Now, it's not necessarily that this different ownership structure is what allows them to have the big budget, or that you couldn't have a big budget without this team ownership structure, or that all ownership structures that are the holding company have lower budgets, et cetera, all of that. It's not to say that, but it is interesting that it has a different structure. So in Team Sky's case, Team Sky is not, say, owned by Dave Brailsford fully and then goes out and seeks a sponsor, and in this case it was Sky. In Team Sky's case, the title sponsors, Sky Italia, Sky 21st Century Fox, Sky, et cetera, I'm just going to sort of lump them all into one, although it is Sky and some subsidiaries that are the main sponsors. And actually the owner of Team Sky was Tour Racing Limited. But Tour Racing Limited was a wholly owned subsidiary of Sky. So Sky owned the team. It wasn't this sort of separate holding company that owned the team, and then the title sponsor came in and effectively was the budget for the team. In this case, it was that Sky owned the team. Now, Sky did, the way they were kind of set up, it looks like it was sort of a recoverable expenditure type setup, and so, the management of Tour Racing Limited, presented their expenses and were reimbursed for their expenses from Sky. And that formed their budget, and it formed a big percentage of their budget. In 2018, £27.5 million was the title sponsor revenue. And then there was some performance sponsorship and other sponsorship that was £7.8 million, and then £2.5 million of value in kind sponsorship, which value in kind is we'll talk about that in a second. So they had this large budget, and it was basically set up where Sky was funding their expenses. But again, Sky also owned Tour Racing Limited. So they owned it. They had full control. Any retained earnings or any line of credit or anything set up in relation to Sky was extremely near-handed, controlled by Sky, the company. Okay, so value in kind sponsorship, we'll kind of go down that road just real quick a little bit. So value in kind is that, for instance, let's say Pinarello is a sponsor, the cycling manufacturer, Pinarello may provide bikes, and the bikes have a value. Let's say it's $100,000 or $200,000 for the year. And if that was the extent of their sponsorship, i.e. they didn't pay any more money, then their sponsorship would be that $200,000 value in kind sponsorship. And according to their filings, ending that 2019 year, 2018, 2019, the Team Sky had $2.5 million in value in kind sponsorship. And just as kind of a note, we mentioned in the last episode, which was actually a Formula One episode, that Williams Formula One team, was being sold. And Williams was famous for this. There was a lot of tobacco sponsorship and a lot of different types of sponsorship in Formula One in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and Frank Williams, the head of Williams Formula One team, he wanted to have value in kind sponsorship. So you'd pay them money, but you'd also provide something. If you were Shell, you'd pay them money, but you'd provide them gas. If you were Pirelli, you'd pay them money, but you'd provide them tires. If you were HP, Hewlett Packard, you paid them money, but you gave them multi-million-dollar computers to do, aerodynamic simulation, right? So that was his big thing was I want money, but I want a benefit. I want a sponsor that's got their name on here, that wants to see us win, that wants to provide us with something good that we can use to try to win and help in our research and development and help in our, various aspects of the business that allow us to get to that finish line first. And so he was a big believer in value in kind. But anyway, so about 8% or so of what Team Sky got in sponsorship was value in kind sponsorship. And as Team Sky was ending their 10-year run of being the title sponsor of the Team Sky team, they were looking for a new title sponsor. As we all know, it was Ineos that became the title sponsor. And Ineos is an extremely large conglomerate. They're involved in all kinds of different businesses. And when they became title sponsor, instead of it being just a straight takeover of the expenses, although realistically that's what it is, Team Ineos, so Tour Racing Limited that owned Team Sky, was sold 100% of the equity, which was divided up between, originally between like Sky Italia. And so, originally the ownership was divided up between Sky Italia, 21st Century Fox, and Sky, the parent company, kind of retaining the rest. Eventually, Sky Italia sold their share to 21st Century Fox, and then Sky sort of retained the rest. So Sky had 60% of the shares of the Tour Racing Limited, and 21st Century Fox had a 40% stake in the Tour Racing Limited. But that group sold to Ineos Industries Holdings Limited. 100% of that share capital went to them. And that's how the change in sponsorship occurred. It occurred with this, basically, the sale of the entire team, the entire ownership of the team. And the change to the Grenadier, the Ineos Grenadier, the Grenadier is a 4x4 vehicle that Ineos, one of the many companies within Ineos, is launching. And the change, is to promote that new vehicle. So it's interesting. So even within the current structure, we're seeing that potentially, and it looks like the Ineos team has a budget of something like $25 million this year coming from Ineos. So even within this structure, within this sponsorship model, there's a situation where a larger amount of money is paid potentially to a subsidiary of a large company than to a separate holding company. So there's a question of, is there potentially more money available to the cyclists and the cycling teams if it's a situation where the large industry conglomerate company or the large sponsor owns the team? Is there more money available to the riders and the managers and that kind of stuff if it has that ownership setup? And does that structure help to provide any more of that all-important consistency? As we mentioned before, there are some benefits to having a consistent jersey, in cycling. Merchandising, recognition, it grows over time. And if Team Sky has performance sponsorship and other revenue, which is kind of lumped into one, so we don't know what exactly their merchandising numbers were and that kind of thing. But if you had one jersey for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, that's a jersey you can sell a lot more jerseys of now, and that might make that sponsorship more valuable. So if you're General Motors or whatever, and you had a cycling team, and you owned the team and you stayed there for a long time in terms of funding it, you might have increased benefit and the team might really have some growth and value. Now, obviously the issue comes into, okay, well, you're not guaranteed a spot on the Pro Tour. You're not guaranteed. You have to keep putting in that money more and more each year to maintain your position. And if you're not getting a lot of benefit out of it and there's a big cost, you might cut it. But if you knew you were always going to be there. So for instance, in cycling, if you were a large company that wanted to spend big money, you could go to a place like cycling, spend big money, get a lot of really good riders, get a great team director, probably be pretty successful, have your team on the front, and kind of win in the sport. Clearly, those long-term commitments, that's not happening a lot necessarily. And so is that prevented by the holding companies? Is that prevented by, the ownership structure? Is that prevented by the benefit that the sponsor receives? So those are a couple interesting questions. And it's kind of an interesting nuance in the way that cycling's set up. And we see a lot of times riders moving around, big contract riders, and they many times they're moving based on title sponsorship moves and that kind of thing. As we mentioned with CCC, Greg Van Avermaet, who's old as a cyclist, 35, and is a great cyclist, gold medalist, and needs to perform and needs to be on a strong team. And with the CCC kind of with their sponsorship up in the air a little bit, he went and signed with AG2R La Mondiale, who, again, as we mentioned before, is very associated with France. And again, it's one of those things when we talk about sponsorship efficacy, it's a very national type situation there with AG2R, and may not totally be driven by bottom line for them to remain around as a sponsor. And they've sort of stayed around, and now here they are accepting a very good rider from Team CCC based on CCC not having a sponsor and them having a sponsor. Here AG2R, as we mentioned, who's been around for a while, very long time, 20 plus years, is able to take a rider from a team that has basically a two-year sponsor. So the setup now is this sort of sponsor, wealthy benefactor structure. And at a company like Ineos, which is massive and extremely, it's massive. Let's put it that way. It's extremely profitable, you could say, but who really knows? But let's assume it's profitable, it's large, and it's able to withstand some ups and downs in the economy, and sort of, so if it so chooses, it can be a strong sponsor. A company like CCC, it clearly got hit by COVID. No one would have expected that type of business situation to occur, but it did, and now CCC's in trouble, and the first thing on the chopping block is a cycling team. So, if there was a different situation from an equity perspective within that CCC team, CCC could potentially sell its ownership stake to someone else. CCC, if it had some level of retained earnings, could sell that exposure basically to someone else. If CCC had some assets within the team that they had accumulated, maybe it was not necessarily cash flow or retained earnings, but maybe it was rights to races, rights to enter certain races, potentially riders' contracts that they could sell or trade, things like that. With a different ownership structure, they might have been able to rework or restructure the deal and the team in a way that allowed potentially that sponsor to remain the same, or for whatever was on the jersey to remain the same or largely the same, or maybe just the color remains the same, or whatever. But with a different ownership structure, there potentially would be more optionality in keeping that group together, the team, the management, the riders, and other, sort of auxiliary sponsors, that kind of thing. Instead of just sort of having that billboard up for sale of the jersey. And a team that had some more of a secure financial future or secure revenue stream, obviously, which is not the case. They would be able to do things like equity capital raises. They would be able to take on debt. They would be able to do things that would allow them to stay around from a financial perspective much more, and not be so beholden to a sponsor and a sponsor situation. And again, CCC is a kind of a stark example of this, but in general, something like advertising is going to be first on the chopping block. And with a team selling its jersey, that's advertising and marketing, and that's going to be on the chopping block in a business that runs into trouble or a owner that runs into trouble, and the riders, the team, they're going to suffer, and they're going to be sort of, and the bottle's going to be shaken up, and they're going to move to other teams and other places, the managers, the riders, the bike manufacturers, etc. And they'll shift all around and they'll show up again. But anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, about CCC looking for a sponsor. It's a tough place to be, kind of out looking for a sponsor, one of your great riders having to leave. I mean, he's an older rider, so he doesn't have much choice. But somebody like Jim Akowitz, who's been around the sport for so long and been successful for so long, won with Cadel Evans in 2011, the Tour de France, and I mean, just countless other victories, is in a position where he's looking for sponsors and got to let riders go. And that's, just 2 years after they were kind of in the same position looking for a title sponsor before. So, it's in some ways it's tough to see, but cycling, lives on, and we're in the middle of a great tour, and we will watch and enjoy. And again, I just kind of wanted to mention this sort of difference in ownership structure between Team Sky and some of the other teams in cycling. And maybe there's something there to explore more, and we will do that in future episodes. So again, thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, tell your friends. We're in the early stages here, and so every little bit helps. And if you've got any topics or any questions or anything, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.